G'day guys, I'm Nick from Time+Tide, and today we're talking about two new references from none other than Grand Seiko. They are, of course, the SBGN019 and 021, two sporty and relatively affordable quartz GMTs, which offer significant bang for the buck. Let's get into some specs, and then I'll share my thoughts on how they wear on the wrist and what I think you might like about them. In terms of the specifications, we've got to start at the case. The steel case is 40mm in diameter, and while that doesn't sound too large, it probably actually wears slightly smaller on the wrist, with 46.7mm from lug to lug, and a bracelet that tapers off very, very nicely from the case. It is likely to wear a little bit smaller. It isn't exactly an example of ultra thin watchmaking. It's 13.5mm thick, but what a lot of people don't realize about Grand Seiko, you sometimes hear people complaining in the comments about Grand Seiko, they're too thick. It's actually to do with how shock resistant and robust the movements are in terms of the protection from the case. So that goes a little way to explain why 13.5mm actually isn't too bad. It also has 200 meters of water resistance. So when you think of 13.5mm in that context, it's actually pretty secure, and for a sports watch, you probably don't want something that's much thinner anyway. Also on the case, we've got a fairly attractive ceramic bezel, which is fixed and has a 24-hour scale around it, which, given the fact that this is a GMT, makes perfect sense. The bracelet is completely brushed stainless steel and finishes or is secured with the classic Grand Seiko folding clasp, and it does taper slightly from 20mm at the lugs to 18mm at the clasp. So not dramatic, but still makes it feel a little bit more refined on the wrist and a little bit more comfortable as well. Looking at the rest of the case, both examples have closed case backs, which is something that you'd typically see in quartz references from Grand Seiko. There are a couple of references that have exhibition case backs and show off the absolutely beautiful Tokyo striping, but these ones have closed case backs, likely to do with the 200 meters of water resistance that the watch is guaranteed to. The case, for me, is classic Grand Seiko. Heavily faceted, sort of short, boxy lugs, and just really, really aggressive, sharp case lines that heavily sort of emphasize the Zaratsu polishing on the tops of the lugs and offer very, very strong contrast against the brushed case sides. Of course, with most Grand Seikos, especially within the quartz collections, the lugs are drilled. So if you're looking to put this on a NATO or something, very, very easy option to do that as well. Arriving at the dial, and we've got something which is pretty consistent with a few other references within this collection from Grand Seiko, and is also a fairly sporty feature. That's an Ampn indicator along the bottom half of the dial, just outside the minute track, but still within the crystal. As you'd expect from a go anywhere, do anything sports watch, both the hands and the hour markers are filled with quite a lot of Grand Seiko's green luminous substance. The dial itself is where things get really interesting, and I think is just quintessential Grand Seiko. They're so well known for their dials, and neither of these references disappoint in that category. The texture reminds me a little bit of the Grand Seiko SBGY003. Now, that was a dress watch with a spring drive movement, but the same sort of sunburst, almost radially kind of exploding from the center of the dial texture is consistent in both of these two watches. And it's a little Easter egg in both of these watches that I think works really, really well and is very true to Grand Seiko as a watchmaker. Now, the movement in both of these watches is one that I'm a little bit familiar with. It is the 9F86, and I'm familiar with it because I own actually the Grand Seiko SBGN007. Just because this isn't high-end mechanical watchmaking and it's a quartz caliber, doesn't mean that they've scrimped at all. Now, how does it wear on the wrist? I normally wear my watches on the other wrist, but we'll try it on here. It looks pretty good. It doesn't sit too high off the wrist, despite the fact that it's 13.5mm thick. The bracelet tapers super comfortably against my wrist, and the case, yeah, it sits really, really nicely. I think as far as sports watches go, this is almost Grand Seiko's response to the Rolex Explorer 2. It's got 2 time zones, it's 200 meters of water resistance, it's got a fixed ceramic bezel, And it's got a quartz movement which is in-house with homegrown crystals and is accurate to 10 seconds a year. I mean, it's about as good as it gets for the price point. Even if you don't like Grand Seiko that much as a brand generally, it's pretty difficult to disagree or have any problems with the spec sheet that these two watches offer. And the main problem, I suppose, you'd really come up against is trying to work out if you like the blue or the black reference more. Personally, I think the black is probably a more under the radar option, while the blue, a little bit more contemporary, a little bit more modern, but either way, you're not gonna make a bad choice. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments below, not just which one you'd prefer out of the blue or the black, but also what you think of Grand Seiko's latest sort of all-rounder sports watch. It's got the lume, it's got the GMT function, it's got the water resistance. Is there anything it's missing? Thanks for watching, see you next time.